The Lord is good to those who depend on him, to those who search for him. What a wonderful promise from Lamentations 3, verse 25. My guest wants to encourage you on that journey so that you will choose a life of service to the King. You'll note I brought my crown today as a focus. There is nothing as rewarding, and it is a joy to welcome Thann Bennett from Washington, D.C. And the first surprise, Thann, is that you aren't a pastor or a preacher. Your career really has been in politics and public policy.
That's right, Maureen. I'm thrilled to be here. I love the fact that you have a crown.
Thank you.
It's right. I'm privileged to work for the American Center for Law and Justice, the ACLJ, and we work in that intersection of space that is between law and politics and policy. So I've been in this space for almost 20 years now, and I never expected...
You look too young to have been doing that for 20 years.
Thank you. I'm going to mention that to my wife. There are some grays in there. But I never expected to write a book that you would expect to come from a pastor. But what I have come to learn, Moira, is that this is not a call reserved for pastors. The pursuit of the King, the pursuit of things eternal, are specifically for every one of us. And if there are people in every space, whether it's business or whether it's politics or law, that are not willing to take up that mantle, that area will be void of the King. So through the faithful pursuit of a God who pursues us to the very end, after nearly 16 years of him calling me to write this book, tomorrow actually it hits bookshelves.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I am doubly blessed to have just enjoyed this so much. In Search of the King is the book, turning your desire for meaning into the discovery of God. Thann, you talk about your first brush with royalty at the age of 19. Oh, just revisit that briefly.
I was 19. I was thoroughly naive, and we had a new president in the United States transitioning into power, George W. Bush. And like a naive 19-year-old, I thought, well, I'll just go help him transition into office. So I called up his transition office, and they politely but firmly told me that they didn't need a 19-year-old who wasn't politically active, who didn't know much about what was happening. So I called him the next day, and again they said no. And I called him the next day, and they said no. So you know what I did? I booked a flight, and I flew to Washington, D.C., and I knocked on the president's transition door and gave him my resume. Moira, it took 3 days. But finally, they decided they weren't going to get rid of me, so they gave me menial tasks for the next 6 weeks. And here's the point. I was searching for association with royalty. I was trying to hook into something
bigger than you.
Bigger than me, and that had longer lasting impact than I thought that I could have. I still remember the day, near the end of the time, we were all exhausted. We'd been working around the clock, but the president came. And the whisper that went through the halls was, "The president is here." That was my first time of having a brush with royalty and what it means. But of course, even that, Moira, that was on a temporal plane. What we're talking about today is something that will last for eternity.
And really the core of your appeal is that we move through 3 phases of intimacy with the King. There is the search, but then we have to move into discovering and ultimately serving.
Well, I think the search phase of that is where most of us engage, right? We're pursuing an intellectual understanding of the King. We want to know more of his words, more of his ways. We maybe want to understand him more. But that's not the finish line. That's the foundation, Moira, and it's a critical foundation. It's one we have to have, but we should be building on that foundation into a discovery of him. A discovery of the King is where you're interacting with him and where your daily life is actually charted by what you hear from the King. But then ultimately, the goal for all of us should be service to the King. It's the conversation that Jesus had with Peter, where Peter's desperate for more of the King. He's desperate for more of Jesus. And Jesus tells him to feed the sheep. And Peter's willing to feed the sheep, but that's not really what he wants. What he wants is more of the King. And 3 times, Jesus tells him to feed his sheep. And here's why. The King doesn't distinguish, Moira, between service to the King and service to his people. Serving the King's people, loving on the King's people, is how we show our love for the King.
Oh, and you illustrate it so movingly. And I'll just preface it by saying, quoting you, that we give up on our pursuit of the King sometimes because we don't understand his ways. You had that wake-up call.
I did.
After a 10-year...
I did.
Well, 10 years of a blinder.
That's right.
2 of them. Tell us about King Rodney.
I had worked in the same office building for 10 years. I'd walked up and down the same street every day for 10 years, and I'd been vaguely aware of the existence of a person over here, but I'd never recognized this person. A new employee came to our office named Ben, and within just a few weeks of being there, as we walked down the street, we encountered this same person along the street. And Ben stopped to talk to this person that I'd never recognized. And as their conversation ended, and this man walked away, he worked with crutches, he only had one leg, and he was without a home, I realized that he was wearing Ben's clothes. And I knew they were Ben's clothes because I had seen them in Ben's office the day before. And I realized in that moment that for 10 years, I had been passing the King each day when I walked down the street, and I hadn't recognized that he was there. Ben had recognized the presence of the King within just a few days of working there. And it's just this idea. Opportunities to serve the King are all around us because the King has concealed himself within the sheep.
Very, very moving. We are going to hear more of your story, and I'm going to warn you, I was in an airport yesterday, and I couldn't resist picking this up. How's that for a headline? This week's Time magazine. Is truth dead? You have just a few moments to think on that, Thann.